some of these Hebrew Bible stories, sometimes when we don't read the Hebrew Bible a lot, Chronicles, Kings, Samuel, the others, we kind of forget the sequence of things happening. So I have a little quiz for you. So did this anointing occur before Goliath or after? Yeah, it occurs before. Before David goes to the battlefield and slays Goliath. So much of popular literature and stories that around that is sort of like David killing Goliath is the emergence of David, but really it's this moment in the story where David emerges as the future king. And we have to kind of, or at least I look at the context a little bit when I prepare a sermon, based on these stories. And this is a period right after what was called the period of the Judges. Joshua dies after they've reached the promised land. The 12 tribes of Israel are in Canaan, and there's not one leader, except there are these judges that seem to appear, and people go to them for different types of help or relief or judgment of things. And there's a very famous entrepreneur now who's named after one of the judges. I'm wondering if anybody could guess who that might be. Yes, Elon. There you go. Elon was one of the judges. He reigned for 10 years as a judge, and we don't know anything about him because he didn't do anything. And there's just a line in Judges that says who went before him and who came after him. Just an interesting Bible fact. You guys will be ready for Jeopardy now if it ever comes. So this story is a reminder of something that I've talked about several times before, and that is that there are so many outcomes in the Bible that go against custom. David is the youngest son. He's not the preferred son. He's not the heir. He's not the one that becomes the patriarch of the family. And you would think, okay, well, that's a little bit out of custom or out of tradition, except that Ishmael was the firstborn and Isaac became the favored son. Esau was the first twin to arrive, but Jacob stole his blessing. And Joseph was the second youngest of all the brothers and got sold into slavery, and all the main brothers that inherited their father's wealth lived until it was destroyed by plagues and drought. So what we have is a history of going against plans, meaning no matter what the plan was, something else intervened and changed the outcome. I think that that's also true of my life, that some of the biggest plans or the most closely held plans that I've had have never come true. But I've also noticed that most business plans don't come true. I've noticed that a lot of other planning doesn't really turn out the way we think it'll turn out. And so that to me says that there's a problem with too much planning. It's almost like planning makes your world too small. I'm not saying we shouldn't plan at all, but it's almost like that attempt to control, that attempt to have security, that attempt to have the right outcome so frequently isn't the best. It's almost like if you have too much planning or too much of an idea of how things should go, it's almost like maybe you miss an opportunity. Maybe you marry the person that your parents think you should marry and you miss out on that one great love. or maybe you invest your money in the safe mutual fund and the risky mutual fund balloons in value. I don't know. I don't want to put it all in financial terms, but who knows what kinds of friends we gain by being open to opportunity in the moment. Who knows what kinds of changes might come if we were just able to hold ourselves open to a possibility, sometimes just a little bit longer. And then there's this part of the story where God looks at David's heart. I find it curious that in the story, that explanation is given to Samuel, but when we hear the description of David, he's this beautiful, loving, wonderful appearing, healthy young man with all the appearances of being good, even though appearance is not the criteria that we use for judgment. But looking on the heart is like this special organ, sort of a spiritual sense of reality comes by exercising that capacity to look at the heart or to open your heart or to understand the heart. There's lots of references in the Bible to what's on the heart of a human being. In Deuteronomy, one of my favorite passages is the passage where Joshua is talking to the multitude and he says, what you need or what we want is not something that's on the other side of the sea, that we want to go over there and get it. It's not something up in heaven that we want to send someone up to get it and bring it down to us. It's already written on your heart. It's already written on your heart. And what Joshua is referring to is the law. Now, I want to make a distinction between Levitical law and the law that Joshua is talking about, because Joshua doesn't quote the laws in Leviticus as being inscribed on the heart. He's talking about the same kind of thing that Samuel is talking about when God says to him, I look on a person's heart. I look and see what motivates them, what's their intention, what do they hold inside of their heart? Maybe a part of their character. If we think about it, and we extend it all the way through the Hebrew Bible and we go into the New Testament, where are the first words about the heart in the New Testament? Mary ponders these things in her heart. She gains an understanding, an ability to see based on her ability to consider what's on her heart. And then when Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, what does he say about sin? He says it begins in the heart, not with the actions. Because if you have lust or anger in your heart first, that leads to either the sin of adultery or murder. How often do we look upon our heart? When we're faced with a decision, when things come to us during the day, when another person comes to us, how often do we consider that sense of what's on our heart? Or how often do we consider what's in the heart of that other person? One of the things that I had to discover in Islamic mysticism was a man named Henry Corbin, a French scholar, and he spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about how do we access that sort of spiritual sense that is inside of us. And what he was talking about, of course, was our hearts. How do you get into that place where you connect to your deepest feelings, your deepest understanding, your deepest way of approaching a problem or another person? And what he said is we have to enter into what he calls mystical poverty. Now, that poverty is not the kind of poverty that's without resources. It's not about money. It's not about worldly, material things. It's more about the condition of the person. Sort of how attached are we to the things that we have? How much control do we try to have? How much security are we looking for? Now, the words that I just used were the same words that I said about how plans kind of fall apart. We make our plans with ideas about security. We make our plans with ideas about control. We make our plans sometimes because we're afraid. And what Henry Corvan is saying is that if that's what's going on inside of you, how are you going to get to your heart? How are you going to understand? Because if God is this power that works through us in a way where we have to give up control, where we have to be open to the possibilities or the opportunities around us, then looking into our heart requires us to be very different than we are with the rest of our ideas about the world. How many times do we assume that we know what another person intends? And I like to think about this for myself. When I'm driving on the freeway, I almost always know the intention of the guy that cuts in front of me. Because I'm sure that his intention is to cut me off, which is probably a ridiculous idea, because he may be doing something that he feels completely different about. That's an easy way to look at someone else's intention. But how many conversations do we enter into where we react to the person who brings us something to think about? Maybe we just need to let that kind of rest on our heart in a certain manner. Now, if we are going to open our heart, if we're going to be open to possibility, if we're going to look at that as an opportunity to engage with another person, how does it work? I mean, we can talk about, well, what's on your heart, but how do you get down there? And then what happens when you're there? Well, the heart's like a doorway to love. When you get everything else out of the way, the attachments, the concerns, the control, or the desire to manipulate something, when you get all of that out of the way, and you begin to access that part of your own feeling, what do you feel? I think you begin to feel love. Now, there's another part about the heart where Jesus doesn't use the word heart, but I think he's talking about the same thing. There's that part where he says, I am in God, and God is in me, and I am in you, and you are in me. And then he talks about love. So when God looks on the heart of David, what is he looking with? He's looking with love. He's almost well, I think he's more than almost. It's like he is entering into the heart of his beloved. And David is his beloved. And you are God's beloved as well. So God is entering into your heart, sort of setting up in residence there. And what happens? When that happens, that same love that places God in your heart then wants to express that love. It becomes mutual. The beloved, meaning you, who are receiving that from God, then can look upon God as the beloved, or your neighbor as the beloved, or your partner, your friend, any other person. So you get this mutuality of love, a cycle of love, and it permeates everything that you see and experience. I remember this poem by William Carlos Williams. It was very famous. It starts out, "So much depends on the red wheelbarrow." And he goes on to describe a red wagon or wheelbarrow in a yard. And so it's like there's this presence of this red toy from his childhood. I want to change that for you. So much depends on your heart instead of a wheelbarrow. It's like that part of us that we don't value in certain ways, even though we know what it means to love. It's almost like it's this part of our being that we have to give a different level of awareness and attention to in order to use it, in order for it to be functional for us, in order for us to be able to see with it, in order for us to be at home in it, in order for us to be able to see another person and to be at home with another person. And as Jesus says, all the way to our enemies, to love our enemies. I had already worked on my sermon before I went to the association meeting yesterday, and I thought about that guy from the Proud Boys and loving our enemies. And I wondered what happened in his heart during that service when he was served communion, when he was invited to be at the same table in honor of a Christian tradition that says something about remembrance, the remembrance of God, the remembrance of sacrifice and love. Of course, I don't know what was in his heart, but I have to believe that it planted a seed that might someday grow into something that will make a difference. That feels like the most important thing that I can say to you, because I was actually going to go in a different direction with my sermon this morning about what's on our hearts. Because I was going to go back to my sermon that I made, my first sermon back from my sabbatical, which I have to say is the most responded to sermon of any that I've ever given. It's the reason I put the quote from Yogi Berra in the bulletin today. If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. And I had no idea that saying something about identity and purpose would be so interpreted with a variety of responses. I think one of the responses that kind of surprised me a little bit is about how hard it would be to know who we are and what our purpose is. I think maybe I was a little bit naive about that because I thought that was kind of not that hard to figure out who we were and what our purpose was. But I think maybe looking at our heart might be more connected to that answer than anything else. And I looked at our bylaws, and we had a council meeting, and I had some other meetings, and you know, we're a church, aren't we? I mean, isn't that who we are? A community of care? I mean, that's where it all starts here. That has to be central to our identity. And what does a church do? Well, I would say that one of the things that a church does, maybe the first thing that it does, is it cares for its members. And through caring for its members learn to care for each other. Now, I know that we're going to say more than that about our identity. And I know that we're going to say more than that about our purpose. But that part of it, I kind of thought we would get right away. Because we talk about being a community of care frequently. Or at least I feel I do. I don't think there's hardly a day in the week that goes by when I'm at work where I don't give that description to somebody that asks about our church. I always start with, we are a community of care. One of the things that I loved about the church that I went to in Gainesville for so long was the compact that they have where it says, we join together as a spiritual community to worship God, however known, to follow, even if imperfectly, the way of Jesus and act in Christian concern for each other and for the world. It's a nice, concise statement. I think we're probably going to say something like that. We'll have our own words for it because we do worship God, however known here, whether it be known as truth or whether it be known as Jesus Christ or whether it be known as God or Creator or Holy One or Lord. But I think if there was one thing that I would want you to get out of my sermon today, it's that you have to learn to access your heart in order to understand anything about your life or our life together. There's probably a lot of different ways that I could say that, but it's something that I think you already know. And so when I say that, I feel like, I feel a little bit like Joshua standing up and say, don't go running off somewhere else to go look for it, it's right here. Or a little bit like Jesus when he says, well, what's motivating you? What's in your heart? How's that directing your lives? Or a little bit like Mary, where we have to think about the things that are happening around us and what kind of role we might have in the grand scheme of things. I had a conversation with a church member this week, and they wanted to tell me how traditional their own orientation toward church was, their own orientation toward God and Jesus and what we do as a church. And they told me that it was a little bit different than me, the pastor. And I told them, I said, I find that really curious. I said, I didn't get ordained in the United Church of Christ to be a representative of Jesus and not understand that as the central figure in my life. I might talk about other things, but I usually try to talk about those things in relation to enhancing our own understanding of that Christian tradition. So for me, I would say, yes, we're a church, but I would even go a little bit farther, even though the term is not as popular or as welcome these days. I would say that we are a Christian church. And my understanding of that kind of Christianity is what I just talked about love, about intention, about what's on our hearts, about how we can use our hearts to guide our decision making in everything that we do. Everywhere else in the world, you might use your intellect to make a decision at work, with your IRA, with buying and selling property, with whatever it is that we do to make a living in this world. But for me, when we come here and we make decisions in this body and in this group, my hope is that it's a decision made with heart, through a lens of love. So that's my follow-up to my first sermon. When I came back, I wasn't sure I'd have to give all those clues, but now you got the full list of clues. And I think that that's important because no matter what decisions we make, no matter what the site plan says, no matter what the cottage turns out to be or do, no matter what goes on the property back here, if we don't do it with heart, if we don't do it coming from a place of love, if we don't do it from understanding how we care for each other and care for the world, then we'll totally miss the point. And we'll totally miss the point if we don't remember who we are. And we'll totally miss the point if we don't understand our purpose. Amen.